The yeas are 214 and the nays are 216. The resolution is not adopted.
We can bring the articles of impeachment back to the floor, so this is not over yet.
What does the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas have to do with fixing our broken immigration system and addressing the challenges at the border? Absolutely nothing.
The bipartisan Senate border bill collapsed, and House Republicans failed to find enough votes in their own caucus to impeach Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Last night's legislative congressional battles illustrate how both congressional chambers are not only sharply divided, but so closely divided. The failure of the bipartisan border bill, which Republicans, including former President Donald Trump, assailed as not going far enough to protect the border, now all but guarantees that any significant reform to the U.S.-Mexico border will have to wait until after the election, despite President Biden's urging lawmakers to do something.
And I want to be clear, doing nothing is not an option. We can't continue to let petty partisan politics get in the way of our responsibility. We're a great nation. It's time for Republicans in the Congress to show a little courage, to show a little spine.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell suggested later Tuesday that aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, previously lumped to the border bill, might have a better shot at passing through as a separate standalone package. Meanwhile, over in the House, lawmakers failed to impeach Mayorkas 214 to 216 votes, but hardline conservatives are already vowing for another vote as soon as the coming days. Congressman Ken Buck, Mike Gallagher, and Tom McClintock bucked House Speaker Mike Johnson and Marjorie Taylor Greene by opposing the impeachment. They voted with Democrats. Here to break down the latest over the border and Mayorkas is my friend and colleague Julia Manchester, also host of What America is Thinking. Julia, what's the likelihood that anything gets done on the border before the election?
Yeah, well, Kevin, looking at what happened last night, I would say the likelihood is slim. I also think the likelihood is slim because this is happening amid the backdrop of an election. And we know that Republicans in particular have made the border policy and fixing the border a majorly political issue to hit Democrats. I mean, you have the frontrunner for the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, in Speaker Mike Johnson's ear, trying to sort of, influence what happens on the House floor and try to, get as much opposition to any border plan that's done with Democrats, sort of just to shut that down. And then with Mayorkas, look, I mean, that was also a political move by Republicans, very much trying to make that a statement. But one thing I will say, I heard one Republican strategist on Twitter say, or X say this last night: never hold a vote unless you know you have the vote. So a major lesson for Mike Johnson last night.
All right, but politically, not only does Trump, it's not about who Trump's ear Trump has, right? He's talking to Speaker Johnson, but he's not talking to Mitch McConnell. I mean, what does this show about Mitch McConnell's leadership amongst conservatives? Because Senator Ted Cruz, the Republican from Texas, I mean, he was asked about it yesterday by reporters. Here's the clip when he was asked about if McConnell should still be the leader of the Republicans in the Senate.
Is it time for Mitch McConnell to go?
I think it is. Look, everyone here also supported a leadership challenge to Mitch McConnell in November.
Now, McConnell's supporters and the sources close to him, they tell me that he actually effectively denied Biden of a border bill win, and he's made Trump look stronger as the standard bearer, which is not exactly a bad thing, politically speaking, if you're Trump. So, I mean, separately, McConnell's orbit by suggesting today that funding for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan is still going to be able to advance. I mean, what are your sources telling you about McConnell's clout within the Republican Party?
Look, I think it's a very divided Republican Party. And Kevin, I couldn't, look at that clip of Ted Cruz without noticing Florida Senator Rick Scott in the background.
Yep.
We know that Rick Scott and Mitch McConnell have a very contentious relationship, that Rick Scott has challenged McConnell in many ways. And I think it's so emblematic of the split within the Republican Party right now. And I think as Trump continues to, on this track to ascend to the Republican nomination, assuming he doesn't hit any additional roadblocks, I think that's going to make things a bit more difficult for Mitch McConnell. We know that although he's worked with the former president in the past, they do have a bit of a rocky relationship. So I think it's shaky. The
they don't
Senate
have a
has
relationship.
Right. Exactly. You're saying the quiet part out loud.
Hey, I'm from Delco. I can be blunt. But it's not just really I mean, it's typical, as you know, just as a journalist, it's typical to see the presumptive nominee or almost presumptive nominee rework the party to his or her liking. But it's very uncommon to see such a significant impact on policy on Capitol Hill. But separately from that, Ronna Romney McDaniel, the leader of the RNC, saying now publicly that she's stepping down in the spring after Trump went on the conservative, ultra-conservative networks and suggested that it was time for her to go. Just another example of Trump exhibiting the power that he feels he can wield rather, on party leadership at every single level, no?
That's absolutely correct. And I think, talking to sources in the run up to, the convention this summer, there's always been the idea that, look, the closer Trump gets to the nomination, the closer the RNC begins to turn over, not necessarily turn over completely, but continues to change into more of, the Trump campaign will be effectively in charge of the RNC or heavily influencing the RNC when he is the nominee. I think that's normal with any presidential nominee in any party when, once you have the convention. But, this goes to show that this is Trump's party. He's going to be calling the shots. And you saw him call the shots when he went on those conservative
and
networks.
He's not merging. Back in 2016, remember, he had Reince Priebus briefly serve as his chief of staff. That was the Trump trying to showcase essentially that they were going to be able to merge the old Republican Party with the Trump Republican Party. That's not what's happening this time around. He's forecasting he wants McConnell gone. He's saying Ronna Romney McDaniel, you didn't raise enough cash, you're gone. And he's saying, Speaker Johnson, you're not going to have a job and you're going to fall in line with the other speaker chaotic mess unless you listen to Trump. So it is a very different strategy that I've noticed, and I've since kind of covering him from that first time when he ascended, I guess a while ago now, 8 years ago. From the hill to the trail, Trump vowing to appeal the U.S. Supreme Court, the Federal Appeals Court ruling, rather, that denies him presidential immunity from January 6th. This could impact swing voters, could it not? I mean, what's America thinking, Julia Manchester?
Look, we have seen polls that show that swing voters and even some Republican voters look at a potential conviction and say that could play a major role in their decision not to vote for the former president. Now, this immunity case, this is going to go to the Supreme Court and they're going to have to rule on it. But if the case is delayed, if it's stonewalled, that's going to be a good thing for the former president, because that means it likely won't happen right before the election. And I imagine, I know that the Supreme Court is not supposed to be political in nature, but for all intents and purposes, it has become a political institution nowadays. So I imagine that they're going to be ruling, that conservative majority could be ruling potentially in Trump's favor. That's going to help Trump with these swing voters. But at the same time, though, I think these constant headlines, whether it's this case, the immunity case, or the E. Jean Carroll case, where he's ordered to pay $83 million, this barrage of negative headlines may help him in the Republican primary, but in a general election, I'm not so sure about that. I think independent voters want to hear Donald Trump talking about things like the economy, crime, the southern border, not his own personal legal issues.
Well, meanwhile, out in Nevada, Nikki Haley lost to none of the candidates. Really. So Nevada had a primary. Remember, it doesn't mean anything because the Nevada GOP infighting required them to have a primary. But later this week, they're going to have a caucus. And that caucus, of course, is where the winner of Nevada's 26 Republican delegates is going to be awarded. Trump is on the ballot for that. He was not on the ballot in the primary. It is very confusing. But Haley World wanted to get a news cycle win out of this. But now the headline is 62.9% of voters picked none of the candidates. 30.8% picked Haley. I mean, Julia Manchester, when you lose to none of the candidates, right before, go ahead, Julia. I mean, I don't even have a question for you.
It's not the best look, and I think this definitely gives her critics on the Republican and Democratic side fodder. But, also going off of that, I don't think Haley's had a particularly bad few days. I mean, she announced that she raised $16 million in January. She was on SNL, got people talking about that. releasing ads. She's very much trying to, remain a player in this primary. I don't think this necessarily helps her, going forward. So we'll see what she does next. My colleague Sarakshi Rai and I did a piece earlier this week about what Haley, her strategy and what her ultimate end game is. She and her campaign are adamant that she is staying in the race. They've given no indication that she will be bowing out. But a lot of strategists and operatives I talk to say, the fundraising, the SNL, the ads, the building of the national profile, the media blitz, that sort of points to, if not a Hail Mary to win the South Carolina primary or do well and go on to Super Tuesday, but also laying the groundwork for something bigger, maybe in, let's say, 4 years' time.
Maybe in 4 months' time. No Labels has not ruled out, even though she says she's not going to do it. No Labels has not ruled out trying to recruit her.